Today, I have some bad news for you. A new study was recently published in the American Journal of Public Health, which found that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is potentially becoming a victim to regulatory capture under Scott Pruitt and the Trump administration. The researchers analyzed public documents, news articles, and they had interviews with current and former employees at the EPA. Their goal in analyzing all of this data was to document changes in policy and to contextualize those changes by comparing them to past policy at the EPA. The EPA has a stated mission to, quote, protect human and environmental health, unquote. But the researchers found that under Scott Pruitt's leadership, the agency has shifted towards a pro-business approach that protects the interests of companies and industries that produce excessive pollution. Some of these documented policy changes include, quote, rejection of a ban on the pesticide chlorpyrifos, currently used widely on food crops, which recent studies have implicated in childhood developmental delays, autism spectrum disorders, and attention problems, unquote. And they also cited several delays in implementing rules and regulations that would, among other things, raise pesticide standards and protect rescue workers who are operating near damaged chemical plants. The Trump administration and the EPA under Scott Pruitt has put delays on these regulations that you can measure in years. The researchers also cite the administration's revocation of the Clean Power Plan, which would reduce carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants. The decision to revoke the plan completely ignores data linking coal pollution with adverse health effects in humans. You might remember a study that I covered a while ago about a coal-fired power plant, where researchers found that the people living in the downwind area were negatively affected by all of this coal smoke, this coal pollution. And this included pregnant women who were more likely to give birth premature and have a newborn that was more likely to be at an unhealthily low birth weight. Now, if you ignore the damaged fetuses and the innocent people harmed just by living near a coal-fired power plant, and you look at this from a more fiscal angle, the researchers found that the Trump White House proposed cutting the EPA's budget for the 2018 fiscal year by 31%, which was more than any other major federal agency. After trying to get this budget passed through the House and the Senate, it was eventually cut down to somewhere in the mid-20s, but it was still a huge budget reduction. The Trump White House has also proposed, and they successfully got this, cutting staffing at the EPA by more than 25%. And under Pruitt, there's been a deliberate effort to internally purge dissenters and to, quote, marginalize, rein in, and demoralize career staff, unquote. This is really insidious stuff, but it goes on. Pruitt has also ordered lax enforcement of current regulations, which is indicated by a, quote, 60% drop in civil penalties in Pruitt's first 6 months, unquote. They've even gone so far as to remove all mention of climate change from the EPA website. All of it, gone, like it doesn't exist. This administration's policy on climate change is effectively out of sight, out of mind. It's quite literally a toddler's response to a scary situation. Hide in the dark and pretend it isn't happening. In their interviews, the researchers found that former and current EPA employees were experiencing a, quote, particularly disruptive and alienating, unquote, environment under Trump and Pruitt. From their paper, the researchers say, and I quote, in late April and early May, some veteran interviewees' appraisals had turned more dire, even apocalyptic. Quote, at bottom, they're basically trying to destroy the place. And, quote, I think the plan is to get rid of the EPA, unquote. There were even reports that Pruitt's management style intentionally created roadblocks and impediments and more bureaucracy and paperwork that slowed down work efficiency. So basically, he inflicted a kind of slow sabotage on the EPA's process. And if anybody's familiar with Republican politicking for the last 40 years, it's to intentionally sabotage a government agency, cut its funding, cut its staffing, make it so it cannot do its job. They cannot function because they're so under-equipped and undersupplied with resources. And then the Republican will point to that agency and say, look, this is an example of government being inefficient and wasteful and wasting your tax dollars. I should cut this agency, cut these jobs, and save the money. See, I'm a budget-friendly Republican. That's the narrative, but it's intentionally misleading and it's intentionally deceptive because they sabotage the agency in the first place. If it was properly staffed and funded from the start, the agency would work no problem and would most likely do a lot of good for the country, like the EPA did, like the FDA does, like the DOT does. I could go on. The researchers say, and I quote, "Our interviewees roundly conclude that the current EPA faces a present and future more challenging than any other period in its 47-year history. Employees across EPA regions and programmatic activities share this perception, and historical comparison supports it." Unquote. The researchers conclude their study by saying, quote, "Although currently available evidence cannot prove regulatory capture, it does show an ambitious, intensifying movement to cripple the EPA's capacity to confront polluting industries and promote public and environmental health. Indeed, this capacity has already been seriously undermined. Health consequences will likely fall hardest on vulnerable social groups, such as low-income communities, farm workers, and first responders. Many more health consequences for all lie just over the horizon, especially if regulatory capture becomes more pronounced, whether or not such capture becomes unequivocally provable." Unquote.